So good morning, everyone. I think we'll begin. Thank you. So the title of this presentation is, So Can I Use That or Not? Navigating Rights, Reproductions, and Risk in an Open GLAN World. But we're going to use the issues that are signaled by the title to talk about a project that Ronan Deasley and I recently worked on in Glasgow, which was called Display at Your Own Risk. I think the best way to describe display at your own risk is, oh, the image is gone. Sorry, there we go. So, Display at Your Own Risk is a research-led exhibition experiment featuring digital surrogates of public domain works of art produced by cultural institutions of international repute. We have some of the examples of the prints at the back of the room, so as you were wandering in, hopefully you got a chance to see them. If not, take a look on the way out. And there's also a stack of exhibition posters there that you can take along with you. But DAYOR examines the path that a public domain object takes during digitization, and it challenges whether a work's status and authorship norms should change simply through the creation of a digital version, which is viewed as a new and independent asset. So what we were really examining is a lot of the policy and copyright practices that cultural institutions are struggling with today, and how that materialized in the policies that they put online and put forth to their users. So to kind of go through this whole experiment, we visited the websites of various cultural institutions, downloaded recognizable digital surrogates, printed them to the size of the material object, producing a material surrogate, and then we digitized the material surrogate. We hosted a gallery opening on June 8th in Glasgow. We invited the public to come in and kind of reflect on the transformation of the work of art from the material object in its original form to how it had been digitized to how it had been printed, and also the ownership norms that were then imposed on that work of art, as the cultural institution may or may not have been saying, this is my original work, this is a copyright, fill in the blank. So the works were presented as the cultural institution's works. The institution was presented as the artist. The title for the file that was downloaded was the title on the title card. Any of the information that was contained in the metadata was also put on the title card as the data about the work itself. Because it often takes a literal translation to fully realize the effect of this practice. So this is a detail of a Mary Cassatt surrogate that's held by the Art Institute of Chicago. But this new work, created by the Art Institute in 2007, is titled 57577_1871930, and it will pass into the public domain in 2102. So you can see on the left that the image is pixelated in the material surrogate. It's almost really beautiful the way that this transformation takes place. And next to it is this title surrogate card, the metadata for which contains no information about the original work, no rights and reproduction information, and it lists the creator as Robert Hashimoto, who's likely the photographer. In the right-hand corner, you can also see that there's a green dot. Now, we told you, I'll explain this in more detail, but we kind of categorize these works according to risk and reuse. So if the users were going to go and experience works online with these institutions, they would know what risk there was in kind of downloading and reusing that in their work. But it also exists as an online exhibition. So you can go to the website and you can see all of the digitized prints. You can zoom in on them so you can see the level of detail in the pixelation. And we took all of this and we made it online, available as an open source exhibition. So the user can actually go to the website, download the exhibition file, and host their own version of Display at Your Own Risk. We put all of the works into a 4-tier risk organization. So blue signaled that there was the institution was open and that there was no risk in reuse. Use was allowed for any purposes, and this came down to 14 total institutions, 28 works which were featured in Display at Your Own Risk. Low, the use was allowed for personal, non-commercial, and educational purposes only. Medium, the use was prohibited online, but there were legal exceptions in the jurisdiction where the cultural institution was that allowed certain types of use. And then high, the use was prohibited. It was prohibited in the online policy. There was also no legal exception in the jurisdiction which appeared to apply. Also in all of these various folders are information sheets that are specific to each digital surrogate. So it's information about the institution's policy, the information about the original work, the material object, the digital surrogate, all of this, and then reproduction information that we put together so that the user would know, here's how it's going to print, here's how we recommend that you do this, and we don't claim any copyright in our photos of these works. And then there's also the title card as well. So this is an example of one that you can see just on the right. So the user can print this and put it along with the works. We even made all of the research data available. So this is a spreadsheet with the preliminary research, which was 130 cultural institutions. We started with the Art Newspaper's 2014 data on the most attended exhibitions, which Wikipedia had compiled into a list of the most visited museums. We then added institutions in the libraries and museum sectors, or institutions we knew had open policies. We went through every single web page, tracked various data points. What was the website called? Where was it located? Was copyright claimed or not? And we narrowed down the sample to 52 institutions of 26 jurisdictions, and selected 100 surrogates from that. So all of this data and more is available in the exhibition file as well. And we made an exhibition publication. So if you just want to read about it, you can go download the publication on the website. We actually got much of our inspiration throughout the project from what other cultural institutions were doing. So I went to the Getty Open Publications and looked at everything that they were doing, the format, the way that it was set up, their plates, the types of, even the table of contents, how was that structured? And I used that as a format. I should also mention I did my undergraduate in graphic design, so that was very convenient. But I used that as the format for our own publication. The font is an open source font that has been made available by Cooper Hewitt. And we use the National Gallery of Art and DC's file management practices and deliveries to inspire how we set up our own exhibition file. So the project is very much an homage to cultural institutions. And we do present that as such in the publication in the way that it's all displayed. But it's also an archive of a moment of digital cultural heritage in time, because digital cultural heritage is constantly in flux. New digital surrogates are being uploaded to the internet under various policies, so it captures all of that information and puts it into one file. We made a catalog of the works organized by risk category so users could read through it and pick some of their favorites. And then plates for each work with information about the material surrogate, the digital surrogate, the material object, and any relevant licensing information. And then we invited contributions from a number of academics, lawyers, heritage practitioners, and artists on topics explored by the project. We even made a metadata book. So the metadata book contains everything that's embedded in all 100 digital surrogates that we downloaded. In some cases, the metadata is incredibly scarce, but in others, it's dozens of pages long. And the book contains a number of meta-discoveries, including anything from contradictions in the rights and reproductions policies, or in some cases, the process by which the surrogate was made. The gallery opening was a blast. We had about 300 people attend, probably the free booze that we also advertised. But we gave it all away in the end to kind of signal what happens when we start to lose works in the public domain and they become restricted by new intellectual property rights, and that access creates a barrier to user reuse. Some people chose not to look at the works at all. Just kidding, this is an exhibition poster. There's some at the back, so please do take some. And we invited the public to engage with works the same way that cultural institutions were doing so in their own spaces. So this is the Van Gogh Yourself. This was a huge hit, another one of my favorites. And we invited them to post their images to social media. So the piece in this image is held by the State Hermitage. Reuse is categorized as high risk, which is clearly communicated on the title card next to that. But here we have 2 users engaging with the work, playing with it, and full knowledge of the risk. And in doing so, creating a copy of a copy of a copy, the copyright to which is completely different at each level of this surrogate inception. So we're going to take the next few minutes. Ronan's going to stand up and talk about some of the themes that the project explored and introduce a little bit of what we want to have a discussion with you about today. We have a panel of experts. One will be joining us in a minute. But after we talk a bit about the themes that the project explored, we want to open up the discussion to you in the audience and have you ask questions to the panels as well. So, Ronan Deasley.
Can you hang on to that and just do the slides?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Ronan Deasley. I'm the Professor of Copyright Law at Queen's University Belfast. So I've been an academic, worked in copyright for about 20 years. And the Metadata Book that we published is by far it's the publication that I love the most, that I have created as an academic. Okay, themes, right. DAYOR began as a thought experiment, and it mushroomed into an incredibly enjoyable, demanding, energizing experience. As you've heard, it's an online resource. It's an exhibition that's featured in Glasgow, London, and now New Orleans, and we're also taking it to 2 other cities in the UK next year. It's a research project. It's a love letter to museums everywhere. It's an act of creative engagement with our shared cultural heritage, and it is a provocation. It's all those things and more. And it has not reached an endpoint. We do not know what that endpoint is. And it begs many questions, so here are some. Rights. Do any rights exist in digital surrogates of public domain works of art? Maybe, we don't know. And that's as good as I can do. Over 150 years ago, the UK government established a short-lived but very forward-thinking national initiative. They started photographing works of art in the collections of British museums and then selling those works of art at less than cost price to the public. And that prompted discussions at the time about the copyright status of the photographs of those works of art under the 1862 Fine Arts Copyright Act. That was over 150 years ago. We're still having those discussions today, which is both extraordinary and incredibly boring. That discussion's happening in the UK, it's happening in Germany, in Europe, it's happening in the US. The Bridgman ruling, we all know, is nearly 20 years old, and it seems to me to be simply routinely ignored by museums and galleries all over the US, including in New York. When can we ignore those discussions? When institutions commit their surrogates to the world as open and free for use for any purpose. At that stage, those boring questions dissipate into thin air. You just don't need to worry about them. It is irrelevant. And yet there's something about the ownership of the physical object that seduces us and institutions into believing that we enjoy dominion over the representations and the reproductions of that object. But of course, property and intellectual property are not the same thing, and copyright is not about property. It's about policy, and we should never forget that. Legality. So many questions. Okay. Is what we did lawful? It might be. It depends. That's as good as I can say. We don't know. And worse than that, we can't know. There's no endpoint for us in terms of is our use lawful or not, except in relation to one category of works. That is, works that have been made available by institutions on an open basis that are free to use for everyone online. Then we're on solid ground. In every other instance of our use of these images, legality is debatable. And we're dealing with a very complex situation in which copyright law interplays with contract law in very unclear ways. So if the terms and conditions of a museum website or a reuse policy purport to prevent use that is otherwise permitted under fair use or fair dealing exceptions in the UK, is the contract king in that situation? Does it trump the copyright norms? Do those terms and conditions even bind to the user visiting your website? They might, but they may not. And even if they don't, the visitor may assume that they do. In the UK, we don't have fair use. We have a very long, detailed, often confusing list of fair dealing exceptions, but certain of those exceptions are protected by a contract override clause. That is, any attempt to get you to bargain away your ability to rely on those exceptions is rendered null and void. Contract is not king in those situations. And that also carries another interesting legal dimension, in the UK at least. In England and Wales, the criminal offence of statutory fraud is committed whenever somebody misrepresents a fact or law to another with a view of securing commercial gain or other form of gain. So it's an inchoate offence. Money doesn't have to change hands. Nobody actually has to rely on the representation. Simply making the false representation about what you can and can't do with certain works might constitute statutory fraud in and of itself. I'm not familiar with the legal landscape in terms of criminal law in the US, but in the UK, now that we have these contract override provisions, I think a lot of museums and galleries need to revisit their website terms of use and just ask that question. Are we being lawful in terms of the claims that we make? Responsibility. Okay. Have we acted responsibly as researchers and academics? What responsibility do we owe to the institutions that we have engaged with? I said DAYOR was a love letter. It absolutely is. That's how we think of it, and it provokes difficult questions, but hopefully in a respectful and responsible way, and you can be the judge. We do feel that we've been responsible when engaging with those institutions that make their content openly available for use in any way at any time. But also, what responsibilities do museums and heritage institutions owe their audiences, to current and future creators, to the world at large, and what responsibility do they owe to the public domain? What does a responsible mission statement look like in a digital era? Risk, the clues in the title, display at your own risk. Would we get sued was something we talked about a lot. It is theoretically possible. We think it is highly unlikely. We feel reasonably comfortable that we can rely on exceptions in the UK for what we did, but only within the UK, because the territorial nature of the rights at play and the online nature of the work itself mean that in theory we're exposing ourselves to litigation elsewhere. So within Europe, one of the institutions that we engage with might sue us in their own jurisdiction, in our own jurisdiction, or in any other European jurisdiction where they can establish some form of economic or reputational harm. So the risk of litigation is present, but it's small, we think. But of course, there is no risk when we're dealing with images from institutions that have committed their surrogates to the world in an open way, free for all to use. And if we flip it from the user to the institution, what are the perceived risks in going open? Or what are the risks in not going open, I suppose, is a more pertinent question for us. Okay, what's next? It's not really the province of old, aging white men to talk about the future, so I'm going to hand back to Andrew here to talk about what's coming next.
Well, one thing that we wanted to make clear was that this was an exploration that was really limited to 2D photographic reproductions of public domain works of art. So once you step into 3D and once you get down to these really, really intense kind of laborious processes by which really high resolution images are made, all of this flies back in our face. We saw a few examples of this. I don't know if you guys went to the Auckland photography. There you are. I mean, I was sitting there the whole time kind of taking this in and thinking, all right, some of these are absolutely copyrightable. Like there's no argument to that, especially in jurisdictions where there's a skill and labor standard that's assessed for originality. But, you know, where is this all going? And do we take points from the different type of organizations that are crowdsourced, like Sketchfab or New Palmyra, where users can contribute things and then they waive any of their right to copyright? Is that something that we should be looking at as well? And then, like, what is next? I can tell you that with the Rijksmuseum, I made 2 different wearables. One yesterday was a metadata skirt that I took the metadata from the work and got it printed through Spoonflower. And then today I have another one on from the same work that I pixelated myself and then got the fabric printed. So, I mean, it can be anything from literally printing it out to the size of the material object and putting it on your wall to enjoy at home, to making something that you will wear and then spread the goodwill of the Rijksmuseum in this type of situation. So how do we create sustainable systems that can adapt to these new directions? And now we would like to invite our panel of experts to come up and kind of talk with all of you about, oh wait, we have one more thing.
Oh, sure.
Oh, the most important. Oprah is here today, and she's underneath your seats. If you see a little white folded up piece of paper, you're the proud new owner of a My DAYOR print. Or if you see one next to you, feel free to grab it. We're giving all these prints away, okay? So you can take one home. We've offered a couple, and one response was, oh, no, I don't like prints. I prefer the real things.
Who's got one? You're
Yay! All right, hang on to it, and then we'll wrap some up for you and sort it out in the back. But come on up, guys.
Okay, if you guys want to...
So again, Simon had a session yesterday where he stressed that, you know, this is a safe place and you can ask any question you want. So I would like to stress that again. Whatever policy that your institution takes, don't be ashamed. Put it forward. We want to hear about it.
You need to ask for a response, a quick response?
Yes. Right. Sorry. Before that, we're going to ask the panelists just to maybe speak to some of these themes. Go down, maybe, okay, so the panelists are Liz Neely. Well, actually, if you could all introduce yourself and where you're from, that would probably be better. But as you go through kind of the themes that DAYOR explores, we're going to talk about legality, risk, reproduction rights, all of that. And yeah, I'll just...
Why don't you start, Simon?
Yeah.
Because I
And
want
make
to
sure to talk into the microphone.
Start from that end.
Start from this end, okay. So, hi everybody, I'm Simon Tanner. I'm Professor of Digital Cultural Heritage at King's College London. And particularly with DAYOR, my concerns here were and today were very much around what do I need from these sorts of open collections as a digital humanities person. I would reflect just very, very quickly that being involved with DAYOR, being involved with Andrea and Ronan has been probably one of the most fun things I've done as an academic as well. So I'd just like to say thank you for that, to them for that. But it comes down to this sort of artificial barrier that we're dealing with in terms of, and the effect that has on scholarship. So this moving wall of when things are in the public domain and when they're not in the public domain, and the paucity of digital resources that are available for things which are in copyright. And that has a number of effects. It has the effect of making some of the scholarship that's done in the digital humanities reflect the values of dead white European males, because that's what's available and that's what we're working from. And so within the digital humanities, we want to use digital tools to enable us to engage with digital content and to ask fresh research questions. But if you're in a situation where 80-90% of the things that you can potentially study are pre-1920, then that will have the effect of re-emphasizing those old structures that are there. So where does that leave us with new communities who want to be represented, who want their voices to be heard, to be seen, to be noted in this environment? And so for me, you know, one of the concerns here as well is about that, if you like, that sort of dead zone that exists in some of those contemporary cultures, and how academics can engage with those in an appropriate way.
Well, that's a lot to follow. Thanks for the pressure.
It's her fault. You maybe go first.
It's my fault.
Okay, so I'm Ann Young. I'm the manager of rights and reproductions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Some of you might know me as well as the editor of Rights and Reproductions, the Handbook for Cultural Institutions as well. And so I'm elbow deep in all things rights and repro, and having to deal with this on a daily basis and looking at how institutions are or are not implementing open access and changing their rights policies for their institutions. And I think that it's important to note that having, in the time that I've been at the IMA, we went from having a very locked down and a very more traditional rights process for any of our reproductions and licensing to now we do offer open access to our public domain images, and that it's unfortunately not just flipping a switch. And it's not as simple as being able to say, yes, these are the public domain things and we can make them available. We kind of had an intermediary step in that, and that it was the technology and the mechanics and the staff and the institutional buy-in to get us to that point. So we kind of, you know, we've had now for almost 2 years that we've had our open access available, but for 2 years before that, we had kind of what I call this interim zone, that before we were able to launch new collection pages that created this automation for access to our open access imagery, we instituted the policy that we weren't charging any reproduction fees for, well, actually we don't charge any reproduction fees for any type of scholarly use, whether the work is public domain or under copyright. But that was kind of our first push, that we were going, okay, we're not going to charge for these things. And we started it where it was even before we had those mechanics. So I think it's important to be thinking about this, that I think it's wonderful, and I would love to see more and more museums institute open access policies, and to have something where it's very automated and easy for users to access, but realizing that there's technology behind that. It's institutional buy-in, that the technology to have, you know, it took us getting a new digital asset management system in place. It took making sure that we had all the information in our CMS of noting not just the works that were under copyright, but also the works that were public domain or with no known rights holder, and getting all of that data put in
linked with the photography, putting it into the DAM, linking all the data there, but then also having web pages that were designed and from our tech staff that were able to automate this process and push that information out there. So it's kind of this two-sided thing. And so that's where I think that if you're not in that place and having those technical capabilities, that there are some intermediary steps and processes and policies you can put in place to still reach a more open audience. So.
I'm Peter Yassi, and I teach copyright law at American University in Washington, D.C. And for the last 3-odd years, I've been involved with a project at the College Art Association in the United States, which has, among other things, produced this document, copies of which should be moving around the room. I think I brought enough for everyone. And Anne has said something incredibly important now, which I want to underline and reemphasize, and that is that open is great, and I suspect that there is a substantial consensus in this room about the principles of openness and their value. But there are predicate questions that need to be resolved before open policies can be instituted. And what we discovered in the first phase of the project that I just described is that one of those predicate questions, which museums and archives and other memory institutions have, is simply the question of what can we put online ourselves, regardless of the policies, closed, open, or otherwise, that we employ in doing so. What can we put online to document our permanent collection? What can we put online to document temporary exhibitions? What can we put online to document our archival holdings, and so on and so forth? And it is in large part to that predicate question that the work we have done is addressed, even though I think implicitly there's a strong endorsement for ultimate policies of openness to be found within the work. And what I can report, and I will do no more than give you the high-level headlines, because if there are questions, you can either read about it or ask. What we can report, I think, is extremely good news for US-based institutions, and at least qualified good news for non-US-based institutions as well. For US institutions, the good news is that the fair use doctrine of American copyright law, as it exists today, fully justifies the presentation of images, not of necessarily the highest high resolution, but of high enough resolution to be useful for all ordinary purposes, including personal reproduction and educational use online without qualification in all of the circumstances just described. Exhibition documentation, collection documentation, archival documentation. And that is true of both layers of copyrights involved, both any copyrights that may remain in post-1923 works themselves, and any copyrights that, Bridgman notwithstanding, may exist or be imagined to exist, which may be the better way of saying it, in documentation. The qualified good news for non-US institutions is that in some cases, they are the countries in which they are located, and UK is a good example, have been moving their more qualified copyright limitations and exceptions in directions which I think would support broadly a similar set of conclusions. And that, I think, is particularly true of the last set of modifications to the fair dealing doctrine in the UK. The qualified good news for everyone else is that having this kind of tool in your law, having a cultural exception to copyright law, is within reach politically and judicially. And all over the world, we see movements which are driven, at least in part, by the aspirations of cultural institutions toward such changes in law. Australia, South Africa, Nigeria, Singapore. It's a long list and it's growing longer. Some countries have done it already. Israel is a good example of a country that's made this move recently and benefited enormously in terms of the state of its cultural institutions as a result. Many more are moving. If this is going to happen, though, it's going to require some level of political engagement by the cultural sector, and I will stop there.
Hi, I'm Liz Neely. I'm Senior Director of Integrated Content at AAM, American Alliance of Museums. And I think I come at this from the end user perspective to a certain extent, in that, which I think is probably the case for a lot of people in this room, in that I have worked on digital publishing programs where we, and anything that, any kind of digital publishing that you have to kind of avoid the certain, so you start to see the skewing, the removal of certain areas that you have to avoid, so you, and basically what everyone's talked about right here. I'm also just really think that we as cultural institutions have this responsibility, so we'll go with the responsibility one here, to be the engagers and to use our collections to encourage scholarship and creativity, and that the world is pushing us in that direction. If our iPhones are these great cameras, we can do 3D modeling with our iPhones, or probably with other kinds of things. I only have an iPhone. So I think, and really going off of what Peter said, is that I would like to take it to a next level, that I think you were talking about cultural institutions and what our responsibility and how it will get there. But I encourage all of us to, that we need to be activists in this area, that our museums need to we need to be having these discussions insofar as how can we be activists to make this happen. Because we can push a lot in that direction, and just even seeing, I don't know if anyone in this room was at the SF MoMA website redesign. If you see that an institution like that, like over the years, like the moving target of, okay, we think a thumbnail is an okay fair use, and it's 250 wide, that we're forced to a certain extent because of what our users and what other people expect of us to look like the rest of the internet, and I think that's fantastic. So how do we kind of all get in front of that a little bit and be activists about how other people can use our things? So that's where I'm coming at it from.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a really terrific panel here, so thank you for getting involved. I guess I'm going to chair the bit. We've got about half an hour for questions. I'm going to do the chairing, and Andrea's doing the tweeting. And we decided on that because I don't tweet. I've never tweeted in my life. So, that's probably a bad thing to say at MCN, right? I don't know, but it tells you where I'm coming from in terms of my engagement with technology. If you've got anyone, questions, responses, critiques, comments for either Andrea, myself, or anyone on the panel, please just hands up. Let's go. Yeah.
Near-term.
I'm sorry, what are the near-term copyright? We talked briefly about potential revisions.
Well, we're doing fine in the States. There's nothing to worry about here. We're in good shape. All we have to do in the States is to use the rights we've got and not allow them to fall into some kind of gray zone or desuetude because they aren't being exercised. And there's no major threat on the horizon, either legislatively or judicially in the U.S. We're at a wonderful plateau condition as far as doctrine is concerned. It's the rest of the world that has work to do if, and it is of course not our choice but theirs, if they or their cultural institutions want to enjoy similar rights and similar freedoms. And what those countries need to do in whatever those countries and regions, speaking of Europe, need to do is in whatever language they choose. Doesn't have to be the language of the U.S. law. It can be any language they choose. Make it clear that in addition to whatever narrowly drawn specific cultural exemptions may exist in national law, there's also a general cultural exemption for the things that are on the edge, the things that haven't been anticipated, the things that are emergent and will never be captured in backward-looking legislation. And that is the function in the U.S. that the dynamic, flexible fair use doctrine plays. Canada has moved substantially in that direction, not by adopting fair use, but by sort of souping up its fair dealing doctrine, so that functionally it works in much the same way. UK is moving more gradually, bit by bit, but still the progress is there. And all over the world, there are movements to this character, I think Australia is probably the most urgent short-term example. South Africa and Nigeria come shortly behind, and there are many others.
Can I ask one question to that though? Do you feel, so you say we're great, we're good in the U.S. We have wide uses that we can use under the fair use doctrine. But do you think that museums are actually taking advantage of that? I get the sense that actually, that we actually are in the fear. We're in a fear zone, and not.
All we have to do is use our rights rather than not. Now, others are taking advantage. You spoke about publishing, for example, and for a long time, I think it's been perfectly appropriate for museums and scholars and others to sort of point the finger at publishers and say, yeah, they're really the problems. They're the one with those ridiculous clearance requirements. They're the gatekeepers who are making trouble. If they weren't asking us to clear all that stuff, we would, of course, not do it. And now we're being put to the test because they are changing their policies. And I don't know how many of you have looked recently, for example, at the new Yale policy. But if you haven't, you should go on the Yale Press website and you should look at the 6 or months old policy there, which literally invites application of fair use in Yale publications, digital and physical, including catalogs.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think that there is a misconception of fear of museums and other, I feel like maybe less so in libraries and archives, but I think especially in museums, of actually using fair use and relying upon it. And I think their risk adverse doesn't even capture, I don't think, the majority of museums. And I think that it's kind of as a responsibility for those of us in museums that have gone to open access and opened up our collections to wave the white flag and go, it's okay, it's not scary, you know.
But there's really nothing more the lawyers can do for you.
And I think it is a matter of, though, also showing that by putting out those high-res images, that we avoid running into the problem that, like, the Rijksmuseum found, where there's hundreds of examples of their artworks online, and they're horrid. That you make that available from your institution and you become the authoritative destination for that reproduction and for that image. So at least what is out there is an accurate representation of the works in your collection. And it's not scary. It's okay. Use it. Do it.
Here's to high-quality shower curtains.
Yeah, take another question. Yeah.
This conversation that I've been following now for many years, we've had CAA come and speak at our institution, often revolves around copyrighted materials in museum collections. But we deal a lot with wanting to put copyrighted images of, that are not from our collections, but relate to an exhibition.
Yes.
Online, in a mobile app, or on an exhibition website. And continue to be fearful and are following a little bit the AAMD guidelines of writing a curatorial justification for each and every image that we want to use.
Yeah.
So is that, I feel like it's a very unproductive way to move forward, and it is still fear-based. It's not being, you know, a proactive museum advocate for fair use. I still feel like it's all very, you know, cagey. Is there any
me start.
Who wants to take that?
Well, this document and the process that supports it and the legal review that it received and all of the other underpinnings that it has fully support the notion that there is no distinction between these cases, that the fact that you own something gives you a context in which you may want to be able to show it online, and in that sense justifies your doing so, but likewise, the relevance of an image that represents an object you do not own, but relates to an exhibition, for example, is another equally good context for reproduction. So there's no doctrinal distinction between those two situations. As to the question of whether or not it is necessary in advance to justify every use, again, this document takes a very, very strong position, which is that it is not. And that what is important is that a curator in a situation like that should be, if challenged or questioned, prepared to provide a justification, which is a very different thing from doing mounds of paperwork in advance. The recent AAMD guidelines are a mixed blessing. And I say this with a tremendous amount of admiration for the speed with which they proceeded to create them, and gratitude for the various tips of the hat that they gave to our prior work. There are, however, things in that document that reflect, in my view, a hyper-cautious approach not justified by prevailing law. A very good example, and I will point it out to everyone because it is the most single toxic thing about the AAMD guidelines, is that in stating the fair use standard for all sorts of different applications, that document says that the amount of material, which would be size and quality, used must be necessary to the project. And if you think about it, necessity is an incredibly difficult standard to apply. It is not the legal standard. It is not the standard of the courts. It is not the standard of our document, all of which speak to appropriateness. And there's a great difference.
Okay, Liz, and then Simon.
I just wanted to say that I think we also, within the museum, have to question our assumptions for what things are. I think, and who is that justification being written up for? I know that when I was at the Art Institute, a lot of this, if you're using a comparative illustration from another institution, a lot of what the relationship is, we need to do this for you. It's about more of the relationship than about the law at that point. And that when we were doing the online scholarly catalog project which was funded by the Getty, that we wanted to ask for things in perpetuity. So a digital image in perpetuity from another institution. And when we asked for that and explained why, we pretty much got a lot of answers. Now, these were older pieces in the public domain, because that's where we started, because of course that's where you start such a project. On the other hand, and I can't make this correlation. SF MoMA was another OSCE museum, and they did theirs as the Rauschenberg Research Project, and they again went to the Rauschenberg Foundation and had the conversation. We're doing this research project. If we had to pay for this, and we want this to be in perpetuity. And they worked out a deal as well. So a lot of this, I think, is also, asking and getting out of our regular habits and seeing what kind of deals that we can work out. And then eventually with Rauschenberg, they kind of relaxed a lot of their things through the foundation. One of the first organizations to do such. And I have to wonder, did that start conversations when they started working with SF MoMA on that and saw what that was? So again, this is where I think that we need to question our own assumptions in our organizations of how we use things, and that we can be perhaps actually pushing things forward even beyond ourselves.
Sorry, I'll be quick and hopefully this will help. I wanted to ask a question back to Ronan, actually, But Liz's comment just reminds me of something I always like to say in these situations, which is perpetuity is a very long time. It's a very long time to keep a digital surrogate alive for as well.
Well,
you
yeah.
know. So this this was such an issue that for instance, digital preservation at the National Library of New Zealand, it was mandated in law that they would keep things in perpetuity digitally, and they kind of went, well, we have a 3-year funding cycle. This is problematic. And so I was going to ask the question, which is about Ronan's statement about licenses not, or contracts not being king necessarily, because we know in these sorts of exhibition environments that if you're taking a painting or an artwork from another institution, that comes with all sorts of written agreements around it, how it's going to be transported, the insurance, what merchandising you're allowed to do using that item. Is it allowed to be on the front cover of your exhibition catalogue? Is it allowed to be cropped? Is it allowed to be... All of those sorts of written agreements within that, and including often charges for surrogate images that may be used for various purposes. So where does the use of these rights stand in relationship to those sorts of agreements that are made between institutions on those issues?
So I think now within the UK, we have these provisos in relation to certain of the exceptions. So let's say there's an exception for non-commercial research, so using it for non-commercial research, or there's an exception that relates to quotation, criticism, review. Okay, so these are two very separate ones. And in both of those instances, if there's an agreement of this kind, and I imagine they're boilerplates that they just use all the time, they may not have been revisited since these changes in the law were made in 2014. And if there's a clause in there that says you cannot make use online, even though that use would otherwise constitute an instance of quotation or critique because you're comparing works, or I mean, for me, I've been doing a lot of talking with archives and museums in the UK, simply saying, if you're putting stuff online, that is research, right? All the back end, right, that goes into making that happen, and the curation and the context that you provide, you're engaging in research. In the UK, we have an exception that allows for non-commercial research. You need to be using it. So I think if you're an institution and you get a contract like that in the UK, you need to be going back to that provider and saying, well, I'm striking this out because the law says I can, right? You cannot contractually bind me to this provision, which I think is a great development. I think it should be extended to all copyright exceptions. I don't know if there's any opportunity for engaging in that kind of discussion in the US. I don't know, but I think it has been, albeit partial, an incredibly important development within the UK copyright landscape that people still have not caught up with. Absolutely.
Maybe respond. No, please.
No, I was gonna say,
I'm going to take another couple of
sorry,
questions here, actually.
of course.
Our time's running, so we've got a question here.
So I had a question that relates to the earlier discussion, and my question is about living artists, and talking about where a lot of museums are now producing files that are large, and so far we've been talking about research, which you can get away with relatively small files, but the distribution of large files has sort of become common, where full resolution large files are being distributed to entities, and it's not the intent of what that file is used for is not really checked, it's just given away. And there are a number of living artists who work digitally, and so essentially the reproduction that's made in the museum is as good as the original file. And what responsibility does the museum have to that living artist to essentially, so that that artwork is copyrighted, and they're essentially giving out a file that is equivalent to what the original would have been could be reproduced, printed. I'm thinking of photographers who work with digital photographers, like Andreas Gersten, for example. What responsibility does the institution have to the living artist and the relationship with that artist, and also the artist's copyright, and to protect their ability to essentially
responsibility to living artists? If you don't want to.
I mean, I would say this comes back a lot to a word that we've already been saying, which is the relationship. That so much of what museums do, it's the relationship with other institutions, but also with living artists and their galleries and their representation. I would say that in selling or donating their artworks and disseminating that way, no, they're not signing over any copyright to those artworks as well, unless there would be something in the contract of the sale or donation acquisition that has that, which I would not agree to. I don't want to be managing their copyright. Give me a non-exclusive license, but I don't want to be managing that. And I don't think that we should be, as cultural institutions, necessarily asking artists to hand over their copyright in specific works, because then all of a sudden you have a potential situation where an artist now has given their copyright over of individual works to potentially hundreds of different organizations. So then 20, 30 years from now, another end user maybe is trying to track something down, and that history becomes very muddied. That said, especially you're talking about, photographers or other artists now working in digital media, again, I come back to that relationship, and that, at least some of my experience in working with artists and contemporary artists who work digitally, they've basically, at least my experience, been like, sure, whatever, I honestly don't care. And they haven't, there hasn't, at least to those who I've worked with, there hasn't been a perceived, market harm or change in value, anything. And if nothing else, that it's more been increased exposure and promotion for their work and getting it out there for them. So I haven't, at least in my experience, run into anything like that, so.
Yeah, I think that you're spot on with it's about relationship, and if it's a living artist that no museum, nobody wants to, especially if you just acquired a piece, put that artist at risk. So it's all about the conversation and what goes into the acquisition. And I think we talked about in a panel yesterday about how generally living artists, and when you work with them on a responsible and authentic level, see the dissemination as a very positive thing. It's the estates that are the
Dead, but not dead enough.
I think I just going to say, I know Peter's going to say something else. I think there's also a role here for institutions to help educate, right, the artists that they're working with, right? Because I've talked to a lot of artists and musicians and writers that just don't understand copyright, don't understand, make a lot of money out of it, but don't understand that other people can, under certain circumstances, make use of their work for entirely appropriate reasons without having to ask for permission. And I think that's part of the role that the institution can play when working with those living artists. Sorry, Peter.
So I want to answer the question, which is a very, very important one at two levels. At the first level, which is the level of law, the answer to the question, what responsibility do institutions behaving well in their own capacity, making legitimate online fair use of works, have to the owners of copyright in those works? The legal answer is none. The legal answer is that the fact that an image that you might put up on the educational portion of your website happens to appear on someone else's t-shirt is not your legal responsibility. This is not a disputed proposition, it's a clear proposition. So only ethical considerations operate in this space. And the ethical considerations, as we've seen today, are often expressed in this notion of maintaining relationships. And I certainly agree that relationships are important, be they relationships between museums and artists, or, as was mentioned before, relationships between museums and museums. We don't have to get your permission to reproduce an object you hold for comparative reference purposes in our exhibition, but we think it will be good with our relationship to do so. Here's the problem. The problem is that what defines a good relationship is, of course, to a large degree, a function of past practice. And as long as one doesn't push it all on past practice, then the demands of the relationship can easily become excessively constraining. Museums shouldn't be asking one another permission to reproduce reference images in legitimate critical contexts. It is, may I say so, a ridiculous custom. But as long as it is a custom, it becomes an element of the relationship. And breach of that ridiculous custom may be seen as harming the relationship. So this goes again to Ronan's point about the necessity of education and speaking openly and honestly with your relationship partners about these issues.
I will just add real quickly to that. I will say that coming back to these past customs and these relationships, especially between museums, comes back to something that I said initially, that for a lot of museums, they do not have the mechanics and the technology in place to make this freely accessible. So a lot of that relationship building and, quote, asking permission or reaching out for this use is they don't have downloads from their website possible for open access, and they might make things freely available, but you still have to go to them and speak with someone there about that. And so that's where it's, well, we want to do this and we believe this is a fair use and it's something public domain, it should be open access and they're not going to charge us for it, but we still need to get the image file from somebody. And I might be able to find something online, but it's going to be potentially low resolution, off color, potentially cropped in some weird way. It's just not the authoritative file. And so it's going back to those organizations and those institutions. So that's, I would say there's a lot of that too that is still in that past custom and process for licensing.
Thanks, Sam. We've got time for one last question.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great panel, really illuminating, and I'm really happy to hear a lot of these things as some of the work at museums. So I work at the Whitney, and even our old white guys tend to have copyright issues because we deal with 20th and 21st century art, and I'm specifically interested in social media, and I'm wondering if you can speak at all to that. A couple of years ago, we opened up our collection galleries to visitor photography, and that was a huge move, and it took a ton of conversations. And now our visitors can post Warhols, they can post anything that they come into that they encounter. And as the manager of our social channels, I sometimes am quaking in my boots to post a picture of a Warhol, even when it is in context, and I'm providing quotes, and there's a reason. And I'm just wondering kind of what you can kind of say about that and social media, and does that fall kind of into fair use? Because I'm often having conversations with our general counsel about it, and I think we are very risk adverse, but I'm trying to push it in what I do, and nothing has happened bad so far, maybe now, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
That's a good sign. And can you do that in 90 seconds?
Yes. Look at honestly, the Rights and Reproductions Handbook has a section on social media best practices, part of that being utilization of fair use, providing some basic attribution and credit to the artwork, the artist, and that information. And by and large, don't be afraid of it.
And this document too.
Yes.
Yeah, don't be afraid of it. It builds brand recognition. It does more for your institution than stopping it. Push it, allow it to happen.
Ask for forgiveness afterwards. If you need to, you'll be fine.
And you've got good lawyers. You should be able to.
We are on time. We heard the tail end of how to give a good presentation at MCN, and one of the things they said was finish on time because it's disrespectful to everybody else in the world. So we are finishing on time. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you to